I love bread. I love everything about bread. I love the way it looks, the way it smells, the way it tastes. A day without bread is like, I have no idea because I eat it every day. And I've had so many friends that have wanted me to teach them to make bread. And of course, we're all a bit shut down right now. We're social distancing. So we're going to have a virtual bread party. So this is simple. I'll show you how to do it. So we start with 2 pounds, 2 ounces of flour. Now I always use organic flour because the ingredients are everything. But you can combine different flours. You might use some white flour, some wheat flour, some einkorn flour. This is a combination of white and whole wheat flour. 2 pounds, 2 ounces. And by the way, you need one of these, a scale, because you just do. You need to weigh your ingredients. That's how bakers do it. You can mush more flour into the cup than it might weigh. So you need to weigh your ingredients. 2 pounds, 2 ounces of flour, 1 pound, 2 ounces of water, room temperature. If it's very cold, I might warm it up just a slight bit to get the chill from it, but room temperature basically. And then 12 ounces of good, lively starter, bubbly. You want it to have sort of a marshmallowy texture, and that's when you'll know it's ready. I did a video already on making a starter and feeding a starter. You don't have to make your starter from scratch. You can get a starter from a friend. I'm a friend. You can get a starter from me. But have a good, healthy starter. A starter is, well, it's a bit like a pet. It's a living thing. It has to be fed regularly, has to be cared for. Yeah, that's about it. So now I'm just going to mix this together into what they call a shaggy dough. So I did a video on making the starter and on feeding a starter, and you can check out the link on my videos for making a starter. You don't have to make your own starter, but it's kind of nice to raise it from a pup. There's just something special about it. So we mix these ingredients to what they call a shaggy dough. And the reason they call it that is because they say it resembles shag carpet. I've never seen a shag carpet that looks like this, but that's what they call it. So, mixing up these ingredients until it just sort of starts to come together. You can do this, by the way, in your stand mixer, and it's actually very simple to do in a stand mixer. I decided to do the whole thing by hand today because not everybody has a stand mixer, but we've all got hands. So, mixing this together, and now it's kind of come together, and I'm going to put it out on my board. So if you were doing this in your mixer, you would just put all of the ingredients in your mixing bowl and run your mixer at low speed, at speed number 1, 2 or 3 minutes. You just want it to start to get an appearance like dough. You know what dough looks like. So now I'm going to start to knead. And this is going to come together. Now, it's kind of a miraculous thing. And when you're doing this in your stand mixer, you can really see it, that these ingredients transform from this sort of sloppy goo. But you're just going to work this, and I'm pushing it and working it until it starts to look like a dough. And you know what a dough is supposed to look like. It's just a big ball of dough. And you're going to work it until it's fairly smooth. Now, another thing you should have besides a digital scale is one of these. And this is a bench scraper, because as you're working the dough, it is going to stick to the board. And without a bench scraper, you can be tempted to add more flour to the board to keep it from sticking. And you wind up with too much flour in your dough. So use your bench scraper. Bench scraper's your friend. And we're about at the point where you see this looks like a dough. It's no longer sort of a stringy, soupy thing. So now what we're gonna do is let this autolyse. What does that mean? No, we're not gonna rent a car. We're going to cover this with a proofing cloth. Now you can use probably a sturdy kitchen towel, but get a proofing cloth. You know, it looks very bakery. You never want to use your proofing cloth for anything other than bread. You're never gonna wash it. Don't dry your hands with it. Don't let your husband wash the car with it. Just keep it for your bread. And we're gonna let this rest for about 20 minutes. And I'm gonna wash my hands. All right, so this is rested. We're ready to do the next step, which is to add the salt. Now, salt does a couple of things. First, let me tell you how much salt I'm adding. I'm gonna flatten this out just a little bit to make the salt easier to blend in. And I'm going to sprinkle 4½ teaspoons. 1, 2, 3, 4. Midi. So now I'm going to work this salt in, and salt does a couple of things. It gives it flavor. I can't imagine what bread would taste like if it didn't have salt in it. The other thing it does is it starts slowing the fermentation process. Sourdough bread is fermented for a long time, and it's generally healthier for that reason. Of course, when you're working with flour and water, you're developing gluten. All right, so let's talk about gluten. Gluten is the protein that is in wheat and certain cereal grains. And gluten is not the devil. The road to hell is not paved with wheat. It's a protein some people are sensitive to, just as some people can't eat peanuts or dairy or other things that people might have an allergic reaction to. So if you don't, you don't. If you do, you do. But with sourdough bread, you're slowing the fermentation process. So the element of gluten called phytates, it's an element that tends to bind minerals and make them difficult to absorb in the body. The slow fermentation process of sourdough decreases the phytates, so the minerals are more easily absorbed. So that's one of the big differences in, if you go to Paris and you eat bread, you miraculously don't gain weight. In America, you eat bread and puff up like the Michelin Man. A big part of it is the natural ingredients and the process. Because in France, even with a yeast bread, first of all, they never use fast-rising, rapid-rising yeast because that shortens the fermentation process. But they'll also take steps to slow the fermentation process, such as rising it for many hours, putting it in the refrigerator, as we will this, and it just makes it healthy and wonderful. So now this is a nice, firm ball of dough, and we're going to let it rise. We're going to put it back in the bowl. We're going to let it rise for about 3 hours. Voila. Cover it with saran, cover it with my proofing cloth, and then you can just hang out and watch me clean house for about 3 hours. or we can use the dough that I made this morning. Should we do that? Yeah. Okay, we'll use the dough. Okay, I'm going to cover it with saran. Cover it with my proofing cloth with its hard-earned dough spots. Set this aside to rise. And voila. Isn't it amazing how fast 3 hours can go by? It's a miracle. All right, so you want to rise your bread until it doubles in size. This one, I've let it raise for a bit longer than I should have. Not that that's a lot of a problem. It's just that it starts to get fluffy, and it can be kind of exciting to watch it get bigger and bigger and bigger. But the problem with it being too fluffy is you'll lose some of that sort of dense chewiness that's characteristic of sourdough. And also you tend to get more holes, and then the butter goes through the holes, and it's just sad. So I'm going to turn this out. Get just another pinch of flour. Lightly flour the board. Again, not a lot of flour because you don't want to add ingredients. You've already put the right amount of ingredients. Turn this lovely dough out on the board. Now this recipe makes 2 loaves of bread, so I'm short. I gotta compensate. Use the bench scraper to cut it in half. Separate the halves because it wants to stay married, but it cannot. Again, I'm going to cover this for a few minutes because I've just disturbed it. I'm going to let it rest for about 15 minutes. Then we'll do the next thing. All right, these have had their nap, and it's time to make them into loaves. And you don't knead it again. You don't need to knead it again. I'm just going to take it, and there's lots of techniques for shaping your dough. And the one that I use, which comes from Nancy Silverton's book, which, by the way, she is my bread guru. She's the founder of La Brea Bakery. I used her recipe for the starter, which you'll see when you check out the starter video. She uses grapes as part of her starter. A typical starter is just flour and water. She uses grapes. She slightly smushes them, puts them in a cheesecloth, and they sit in the flour and water. They add to the fermentation, and they also enhance that sort of sour, that tangy flavor that you get from sourdough, which I love. I love sort of a sour flavor. But her method of shaping the loaves is basically to just sort of treat it like you're turning a steering wheel. So you turn it around a bit, and what you're doing is building up some surface tension in the dough because you don't want all the steam to escape right away from the dough. You want it to stay in. So that looks perfect. I'm going to shape the other one. And again, it's just a steering wheel, and you can kind of give it a drag every now and then, and that sort of adds to the surface tension. And those are some fine looking dough balls. Just about there. Just tighten it up a bit. Good. Now another thing you're going to want are these baskets. They're called bannetons. There's different ways you can raise a bread, but I like the bamboo banneton. It has the nice spiral pattern, so it makes a pretty bread, as well as just being a very typical way to rise it. And give it a good flour every time you use it. Again, this is not really something that you ever need to wash. For one thing, just the starter in itself, it's the thing that activates it is bacteria, wild yeast. it's called. And you're going to bake this at 450 degrees, so you're going to kill anything. But you never wash your bannetons. Plop in the dough. Voila. I'm going to cover this with saran. This is going to sit on the counter for about 2 to 3 hours until it starts to rise. Now, let me tell you a little something about the timing of rising your bread. Your bread cannot tell time. So, in your first rise, which is called your bulk rise, it generally takes about 3 hours, but here's the thing, if your kitchen's a bit warm, it might rise in 2. If your kitchen's a little bit cold, it might take 4 or 5. So you're really looking for the volume. So the bread the first time should double in size. For this rise, we're going to wait until it's just started to rise, sort of come up the sides of the bannetons, and then we're going to put them in the refrigerator. It's going to rise there overnight or minimally 8 hours. You can go up to, I think, probably 18 hours, but they're going to rise a nice long time. So, again, I'm going to cover these with saran. Now, this is a little trick that I figured out all by myself because saran wrap doesn't stick to bamboo, and I just take a rubber band. It works well. I get lots of them. They come in the mail every day. Okay, so this will sit on the counter a couple of hours. It'll go in the fridge. Usually I time it so that I'm ready to stick it in the fridge when I'm ready to go to bed. I bake when I get up in the morning. If you don't want to bake first thing in the morning, it's totally fine. It will sit there sleeping until you're ready. So now this loaf it rose for a couple of hours on the counter, spent the night in the fridge. When you take it out of the refrigerator, uncover it so that you don't get condensation from the saran. Let it sit on your counter 2 or 3 hours. Should have a bit of spring to it. And I'm going to very delicately sort of coax it out of the banneton onto parchment paper. Now there's all different techniques for doing this. I've baked it before just on a sheet pan with a little cornmeal on the bottom. I have baked it on a sheet pan with parchment paper, but my current favorite method is to use a pot to bake it in, because a pot with a lid on it maintains the steam. It creates a steam environment. So I cook it with the lid for 20 minutes, the lid on, take the lid off, and let it cook for about another 20 minutes until the bread is the color that you want. You know, in Paris, if you go in a bakery, they'll usually have a light loaf or a dark loaf. You can choose which you want because it's kind of a personal preference. But about 20 minutes with the lid on, 20 minutes with the lid off, and then you decide how dark you want your bread. So this step, in Paris, at least the chef that instructed me there, they call it scarification. In America, it's sometimes referred to as slashing, because you're a slasher. But this is a tiny blade. You can use a sharp knife. You could use a plain razor. And you're going to just cut it gently, about a ½ inch in. That's going to give the steam somewhere to escape, because otherwise it just tends to kind of blow out anywhere and make holes. So you want to tell the steam where to go. So now my oven has preheated with my pan in it to 450 degrees. I have a pan of water in the bottom of the oven, on the bottom shelf, to create a steam environment, and I set my pan on top of a sheet. And what that does is it protects the bottom from getting too dark, because everybody wants a beautiful bottom. Okay, so we've got the bread gently turned out onto the parchment paper. The oven has been preheating to 450 degrees. We want a nice warm oven to start that steam process. Now you can see I have a tray of water in the bottom of the oven, and my pan has been preheating. I have a tray under the pan so that the bottom of the bread doesn't get burned. I'm going to take the four corners of the parchment paper and just gently pick this up. Now the bread, it'll look like maybe it's getting a little bit dented. Don't worry about it. It's going to rise in the oven. Lower it into the pot. Pop on the lid. And voila, that's good for about 20 minutes. In 20 minutes, I'll take off the lid, let it cook for at least another 20 minutes, and then let it go a bit longer until it's exactly the color that I want. And then it's bread. And voila, we have the finished product. It's got the beautiful seam where we scarified it. It has a beautiful bottom, as we all want, and it's ready to eat. So let me show you the inside. Now, ideally, you'll let it completely cool before you cut it. And that's not always easy. And you know what? It's baker's rights. If you want to cut it while it's warm, you can. But it's quite soft when you try to cut it warm. So, beautiful density. No big holes for the butter to fall through. It's nice and soft. It smells so good. So I hope this was helpful. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Click the little bell for notifications so you don't miss a video. And I hope I've answered all of your questions. If you have more questions, visit my website, kellypalm.com. Email me, kelly@kellypalm.com. I might even send you a starter. Bon appetit.